Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Brant History Happy Hour. I'm Natalie. Nathan, do you know what month it is?
June?
Correct, but it's also National Indigenous History Month. So this week's episode is going to spotlight some Indigenous history. And so for the drink this week, I'm just drinking a nice iced tea, very refreshing, and I put some strawberry on it as well. So feel free to join us in a nice beverage like this. And the reason why we're drinking iced tea too is because in some of Evelyn Johnson's memoir, so that's Pauline Johnson's sister, she actually talks about all these different visitors who would come to Chiefs Wood, where they lived in Six Nations. And Evelyn would mention that sometimes they would serve tea, and so I figured instead of having a very hot tea during the summertime, we're gonna have a nice iced tea. So this week, we're going to, like I said, spotlight some Indigenous history stories, and we've been talking a lot about people like Bell, Cockshut, and so it's important that we obviously recognize the traditional people of this land, and we recognize the amazing contributions that they have given us as well.
Okay, so where should we begin?
Well, I think that we should start from the land. So, essentially, Indigenous peoples have been on Turtle Island for time immemorial, or what we know as North America. So the traditional people of this land, a little bit of a recall from last week, but are the Attawandaron people, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. And so, essentially, when we were talking about Brantford last week, the Haudenosaunee people came up with Tyendinaga, Joseph Brant, following the American Revolutionary War, and they were granted 6 miles on either side of the Grand River in 1784, following the Haldeman Proclamation. So essentially, that is how Joseph Brant came up, and he established the Mohawk village, or what eventually came into Brantford. But what happened was that when he came up with the Six Nations, there were other nations as well. So you had the Nanticoke people, you had the Delaware people, and there was also some Tutelo people.
Wait a second. You said Tutlo? Isn't it Tutla?
It is not, actually. It is the Tutelo people. So Tutela Heights sound familiar? Yeah, so essentially where the Bell Homestead is, or Tutela Heights, that was actually where the Tutelo people were when they came up. And so essentially the reason why they're not there anymore is because of colonization, but also because of the cholera epidemic in 1832 actually really impacted them. And so that's why there's sort of no one there anymore. And so really sad, but essentially they were there, so we do have to recognize that, and that's how we sort of get the names, right, when we're thinking about early settler maps of Brantford and things like that. And so when the Bell family comes, the Tutelo people, they're actually now in northeastern, the Tutelo tribal nation can be found like northeastern US, or Eastern Canada if you're interested in looking up some more information. But anyways, when the Bell family comes up, they're like to Canada, they're moving from Scotland to Canada. It's like the 19th century, right? Like industrialization, like this big settler tidal wave. But essentially, when the Bell family comes here, Alexander Graham Bell actually learns about the Six Nations, and he realizes that, oh, like these people are here too, and that we have 2 cultures here, the Western way and the Indigenous way as well. So he becomes acquainted with them.
There was actually a point in which Bell would transcribe the Mohawk language into visible speech symbols. Of course, this is a Western way of describing language and writing how it sounds, with language being sacred and reflecting knowledge of Indigenous peoples. But we often don't talk about this side of the inventor. He was also apparently made an honorary chief of Six Nations.
So Bell actually went out and visited people on Six Nations?
Well, here's the thing. At one point, So think of Bell Homestead, right? A great Victorian home. There's another really cool Victorian home right on Six Nations, and that is Chiefswood. So that was the home of the Johnson family. So you have Chief George Johnson and his British wife, Emily Johnson, or who was Howells previously. And so two different cultures in that household, and that's the family that had Pauline Johnson and her siblings, Evelyn, Alan, and Beverly. So they're a family on Six Nations, right? And obviously we know that Pauline goes on to be a poet, and more about that later. But essentially, one time, George Johnson was in town in Brantford, and he actually ran into Alexander Graham Bell. So essentially, he was invited for dinner. The Bell family was invited to Chiefswood, and so made their trek from the Bell Homestead out to Chiefswood. And what ended up happening is that when they got there, you gotta think about Chiefswood, right? Like, it's got two entrances, so to honor basically the two cultures and people that would come and visit the home. So you have the entrance to the Grand River for those who would be coming in by canoe or by boat, and then you also have the regular front door for people who would be coming by the like from the road, right? And so that's how the Bells came, right? And so I don't think Bell had a boat, but what ended up happening was that they came, and so when they were there for the dinner, Bell's father was like, if you don't mind, like, my son can say the Lord's Prayer in sign language. So Alexander Graham Bell did that, and Pauline was apparently like enthralled that he was doing that. She thought that was really cool. And also Mrs. Bell, so Graham Bell's mom, was deaf, and so she had an ear trumpet. And anytime the group told a joke or whatever, Bell would have to go over and explain it. But this is all through Evelyn's memoir, and I just think it's such a cool little tale that the two of them, like Pauline and Graham Bell, met and had that opportunity.
The Bells were like, these gooseberries are the best gooseberries we've had since England. Nice job, Johnson family. But the funny part is that Evelyn and Pauline discovered later on that the preserves were actually white currants and not gooseberries.
Anyways, Bell returns the favor for the Johnsons, having them over, and he invites George Johnson over for dinner as well, so super nice of him. Anyways, what ends up happening is that George Johnson pulls up to the Bell Homestead on Tooele Heights, and he sees Bell there, and Bell's got his jacket off, and he's tacking all of his wire up against the house, and George is just there for lunch. He'd be like, whoa, what's going on? But anyways, they go in and join the rest of the Brantford yuppies that were there as well, and they go and they have their lunch or their dinner or whatever, and what ends up happening is that afterwards, Bell's like, all right, you guys, check this out. And he shows off, classic Bell, the telephone, essentially, or an early test of it. And what ends up happening is that each of the guests gets a chance to sort of speak over the phone, which was connected in town to the Great Western Telegraph Office. And on the other end of the line was a Walter Griffin, and so he's ready to receive all the fun times of Bell's afternoon lunch or dinner with his pals. And so everyone gets a turn, and when it gets to George Johnson, he actually speaks in Mohawk over the phone, and Walter didn't get it, but you gotta love it, right? Speaking the original language over the phone, probably one of the first times that a language other than English was spoken over the phone, and also probably one of the first times an Indigenous language was also spoken over the phone. So you gotta really realize when people of Six Nations or Indigenous people are sort of in these elite social circles or these important historical moments as well, and just recognizing that. But anyways, super cool moment.
Wow, can you imagine being invited to both places for a house party?
I know, right? Talk about Victorian era fun. Woo! But anyways, Evelyn Johnson, so Pauline's sister, actually recalls, that wire that Bell was packing up before the party. One of his fellow workers, Mr. Sherman, who did some work with Bell, he actually cut off 3 inches of that wire and gifted it to Evelyn. And she sounded pretty proud of it, and I don't blame her, but pretty cool that she has a piece of that. But anyways, yeah, so you have Chief's Wood, which, beautiful, faces the river. You have the Bell Homestead, the thinking place, right? Super fun. But there's another house that I would have liked to have seen in the Victorian times in the 19th century. And I was actually driving with my mum down Colburn Street, and I saw this blue historic plaque, and I'm like, what?
Where?
The Echo Villa! So, it's not a museum, but it would be pretty cool if it was, in my opinion. Anyways, it was actually built by Kakawakanabe, or Reverend Peter Jones, who was an Ojibwe Methodist minister. So his dad was Augustus Jones, who was an American and who was a surveyor, and his mother was Tabananikwe, who was a Mississauga woman, so Mississauga of the Credit River, whose band was around the area. So the family moved to Brantford in 1817, but by this point, Peter Jones had a stepmother. But essentially, what happened was that Augustus would take Peter out of school and began to instruct him in farming, and he would just fluctuate being in school and doing some farming, but eventually he got trained and became a minister. But anyways, Jones was really important and was involved with the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Munsee Mission, doing translations, preaching, traveling, establishing schools, and near the end of his life, he moved to Echo Villa, but he's actually buried in Greenwood. Anyways, Jones's home cycled through various owners, but I think it's super cool and important that he lived there and was a part of this local area, right? But essentially what ended up happening was that his home was the site of where in November 1956 that the Six Nations and the Brant Historical Society had a meeting, and there was a ton of people there, and they wanted to talk about erecting a plaque for the famous Onondaga runner, Tom Longboat. So super cool that it happened in Peter Jones's former home. But anyways, the BHS and the Six Nations were also involved in getting historic plaques up for Chief's Wood later on, and declared that a National Historic Site, as well as the Mohawk Chapel. So if you're thinking about the Mohawk Chapel, it's the oldest church in Upper Canada. It's a royal chapel too, like Her Majesty's Royal Chapel of the Mohawks, because it was super important to the first Mohawk mission. And so because it's a royal chapel, whenever Queen Liz, has to go to church in Canada, she has to go to a royal chapel. So whenever she comes here, she can go to church only at the Mohawk Chapel or another royal chapel. Speaking of Cheesewood, it would not be a Brant historical moment if we didn't talk about Dagambwage, who was Pauline Johnson. So arguably one of Brantford's favorite poets, and of course Six Nations. She lived from 1861 to 1913. She wrote a variety of poems that spoke about the land, about her identity as well, about Indigenous issues. And as I mentioned, she was half Mohawk, half British because of her mom, or English technically. But what ended up happening was that a lot of her poems would speak about that as well. But she wrote for the Expositor as well, which was also really cool. And she lived in Brantford and Oswego, and would often go back and forth from both places. But like I said, she was born on Six Nations. And so essentially her poems are so beautiful, and actually we did a reading of one of them in our Museum Month programming, or a couple of them actually, so go take a peek. But anyways, Nathan, what's your favorite poem?
Oh, that's a tough one. I have to pick one, the song My Paddle Sings, I think it's called.
So Pauline was a traveling girl. She went all over the States. She went to England. She was also in Canada, traveling everywhere for her poetry and her performances. But actually, let's talk a little bit about her Brantford connections too. So, Pauline spent her childhood on Ohsweken, but growing up as a younger girl, she attended Central School, or Brantford Central Collegiate. And she was enrolled there because her brothers attended the Mohawk Institute, and her parents wanted a better experience for her upon seeing what Beverly and Alan went through. So I could go on and on about Pauline, but I also want to bring up her sister Evelyn again for a second. Everyone was like, oh, well, if you like Evelyn, you'll love Pauline. But Evelyn was also a busy gal in town, so let's give her a little bit of love. She actually attended Helmut's Ladies' College in London, Ontario. But collectively, the sisters also knew about the affairs of the residential school, the Mohawk Institute, even as they moved beyond Brantford. So Brantford is where the Mohawk Institute was opened, and it was one of the oldest and longest running residential schools in Canada. Actually, one of the principals, Robert Ashton, was actually the chaplain of the Dufferin Rifles as well, and he treated the school often like a military. The goals of residential school were to assimilate Indigenous children into European society. Often, when there was a special visit to the Mohawk Chapel, the pupils would be there too. Part of the process, especially here in Brantford, was aiming for students to go somewhere when they graduated from the Mohawk Institute and live in white society by taking their culture. So many students from the Mohawk Institute went to BCI afterwards. Some did some studies at the Conservatory of Music in town, and some students even went to work at the Brantford General Hospital afterwards. So you can imagine how industrial Brantford was building, and then the Mohawk Institute was a part of this new fabric.
Evelyn Johnson actually wrote to the Toronto Sunday World newspaper in November 1923. She wrote what was dubbed by the principal at the time as an infamous attack, talking about the school conditions and the children being hungry, and calling out the Ashton family that ran it. Also, she added that Pauline, although she was out west at the time, also wanted to bring light to the conditions at the school. The superintendent of the Six Nations people said to the Indian Department that it was entirely false.
So it's time to really understand the truth and reconciliation, and as we work forward to reconciliation. And actually, June marks 12 years since the launch of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and social isolation is the perfect time to be brushing up on the TRC's calls to action and give them a little bit of a read.
Yeah, museums are included in those, aren't they? I think it's recommendations 67 to 70.
That is correct. So yeah, the TRC touches on basically almost all aspects of our lives and how we can be better allies with Indigenous people if you're not Indigenous and whatnot. But essentially, going back to Pauline. So Pauline, when she was in school, she loved English, she loved history, didn't love math, but she did a lot of performances and plays, and she was actually a part of the Brantford Players at one point.
Pauline graduated in 1877, right after the year 1876, when the Indian Act was established. Basically, the government gave itself the authority to determine who was Indigenous and who was not. It's still at work today. Regardless, Pauline worked in her poetry to dismantle who could determine who she was, and she knew that she was Indigenous. In Brantford, Pauline would often shop at Cockshut's store and even picked up sheet music at Riche's music shop for her brother Beverly. When she lived in Brantford, she also met another local author, Sarah Jeanette Duncan. Duncan wrote The Imperialist and was also writing for other newspapers. The two reportedly had the same social circles, but they were always thinking about each other's writing. Sarah actually used to publish in the Globe under the pen name Garth Grafton. One time, she interviewed Pauline at her place in Napoleon Street and published the interview in the Globe. Pauline was starting to make a name for herself. One of Pauline's close friends in Brantford was Jeannie Martin, who ended up marrying F.D. Revel, the known local historian. You know, like the guy who wrote the history of Brant County, the big bad Bible of Brantford history. At one point, when our poetess was just experimenting with publishing, he read one of her poems and was like, "Pauline, what the heck? This is good stuff." The poem was called My Jeannie, after his wife, of course, but he was still like, "No, we're not sending this to any old magazine. Send it to Gems of Poetry." And sure enough, it was published in New York. Woohoo! Because Pauline was a rock star.
I gotta say, Pauline had the coolest pals. Like, you got historians, you got local authors, you got canoeists, like so many people that she met in her lifetime on her travels. But someone who was not her friend was the group of 7 homie, Lauren Harris.
When her father died, she lived at 7 Napoleon Street. There's actually a funny tale of Lauren Harris, the group of 7 homie from Brantford, who lived a couple doors down from the Johnsons. Harris was a troublemaker and actually was caught flinging mud at the Johnsons' clean sheets. What a little bugger!
He should have owed her a painting, eh?
Weren't they both out in BC too?
Yeah, they both lived there at different points in their lives, but it's an interesting parallel having those Brantford folk out west in Vancouver.
So how does Pauline get famous in Brantford then?
Okay, so what ended up happening was that she was a pretty social gal, and she was present at the unveiling of the Brant monument of Tyandanega, who we started this week's episode talking about a little bit. So they had a statue that they wanted to commemorate him with. Each of the 6 nations are on the statue as well. And so she was there, and the day goes like this.
So, it's October 1886. Everyone, people from 6 Nations, Brantford, are coming to this super important unveiling. The procession started at 12 o'clock from the Indian office, which was located at Dalhousie. Then they came down a couple other streets and entered on the south side of Victoria Park. It was packed. There was a ton of people there. Again, big Brantford boy, William F. Cockshut, was there, and he was going to give a couple of speeches. Hold on. Pause the video. Pause.
Time for a quick genealogical moment. So, W.F. Cockshut was actually married to Minnie Ashton. Does that name sound familiar? I think it does, because Minnie Ashton, was the daughter of Robert Ashton, who was the principal of the Mohawk Institute. And also, Cockshut had the factory, that big booming Cockshut factory, was right next door to the Mohawk Institute. And he definitely knew about the Institute too, because on December 24th, 1923, he actually sent a crate of oranges, I think, for Christmas.
Back to the memorial. Anyways, Cockshut is getting ready to be this big budding politician, was already a part of the Brantford bourgeoisie. So he gets up to the monument and he's like, "All right, everyone listen up. Brant is our important guy, and I got a poem right here about him, written by a local poet. Shout out to my girl, Pauline." So Cockshut read her poem, An Ode to Brant, that day, which helped kick off her fame around the city. Part of it went like this. "So Canada, thy plumes were hardly won without allegiance from thy Indian sun. Thy glories, like the cloud, enhance their charm with red reflections from the Mohawk's arm. Then meet we as one common brotherhood in peace and love with purpose understood. to lift a lasting tribute to the name of Brant, who linked his own with Britain's fame, who bade his people leave their valley home where nature in her fairest aspect shone, where rolls the Mohawk River, and the land is blessed with every good from heaven's hand, to sweep the tide of home affections back, and love the land where waves the Union Jack.
Wow, ode to Brant. Isn't that beautiful?
So Pauline, even though she left Brantford and the Six Nations and traveled everywhere, she still left us with this amazing legacy of poetry and her family's history as well. And so not only them, but the amazing Indigenous history that we have from our city and Six Nations, the surrounding communities. And so we hope you enjoyed our Indigenous history special, and that we will see you next week. Cheers!